Well, it's good to see everybody and missing a few, but started looking at this restoration and this Reformation movement that starts, and want to talk about a few of those guys this morning. The first one is Wiggly, and he's in Zurich. And, I'm in trouble. So, I get there once in a while. Generally get out eventually. Can I go now? Okay. So we talked a lot about this break in Eastern and Western, and we talked a lot about getting us to the Bible. And once God's Word became in print, I'm going to get us there in a minute. Once God's Word came into print, things started to change. A lot of things started to change. And we talked a little bit about some of these guys, but we're going to spend a little more time on these reformers. You know, a lot of things has happened, right? The Bible's becoming available in a lot of languages. The church is being attacked from those within it. People within the church are breaking out of the church. England renounced the authority of the Pope. The Church of England's established. So there's three great reformers we're going to look at in Germany, Switzerland, and France. And they're going to make history, right? That's kind of where we all kind of came from. We talked a little bit about the veneration of relics last Sunday morning and the sale of indulgences. And I could tell a lot of y'all had never heard of those things before, so that was a little bit interesting. So glad to inform you on that. This guy, Zwingli, is really kind of an important figure in Zurich, and he was a guy who took the organ out of the cathedral, and actually destroyed it in the street, actually broke it apart in the street. He was quite a musician, but he believed that the organ was a vestment, and he believed it was an idol, and he thought it had no place in the church, and so he threw it out. It is not known what he thought of musical practice in their Lutheran churches. Zwingli, however, eliminated music from worship in the church, stating that God had not commanded musical worship. The organist of the People's Church in Zurich is recorded as weeping upon seeing the great organ broken up. But that's really not the big thing I want to talk to you about him. I just kind of want to throw that in there because we'll kind of look at that a little bit later or on my Wednesday night class. But this is the big thing. It's the Anabaptist movement. So, so this is Zurich, and nobody baptized adults, all right? Did not happen. Did not happen. There was no such thing as adult baptisms. People were baptized as infants. It was pedio baptism, and that's what happened. And that transpired into all these reformers, even though they were doing these reformations and they were breaking away from the Catholic Church, they were challenging all these old religious adages and these things that were going on, they still were baptizing babies. And there was a movement in Zurich, and it's called the Anabaptist movement. And that seems kind of like weird when I say that, because for me to say the Anabaptist, you would think somebody who didn't believe in baptism, right? But the Anabaptists, that's not what it was about. The Anabaptists were rebaptizing adults, and they didn't believe in the baptism of infants, okay? They didn't believe in infant baptism. That was really a big thing. And it will be a big thing for centuries, okay? It was a big thing. And in March 7th of 1526, it was released the notorious mandate that no one shall rebaptize another under the penalty of death. You know, it almost seems weird when I say it, but people really take offense to challenge of their religious beliefs. Would you believe that? I mean, it seems like it wouldn't be as big a deal as that. But these people, these Anabaptists, and what you got to remember is this Anabaptist movement, that's where you get your Amish, your, why ain't it coming to me this morning? basically that whole side of the United States religious movement, your Amish, your Puritans, your the Quakers, a lot of that branch of movement, they all came out of the Anabaptist movement, okay? That all came out of this. But what happened was, in 1526, there was this mandate that said you can't rebaptize another person under the penalty of death. And although Zwingli technically had nothing to do with the mandate, there's no indication he disapproved. Felix Manz, who had sworn to leave Zurich and not to baptize anymore, he was the guy, one of the leaders in the Anabaptist movement, he deliberately returned and continued the practice. After he was arrested and tried, he was executed on the 5th of January, 1527, by being drowned in the Limmat River. He was the first Anabaptist martyr. 3 more were to follow, after which all others either fled or were expelled from Zurich. So these guys were actually put to death because they baptized somebody, which almost seems weird for me to say that, but that was a challenge to the faith of pedio-baptism, to the idea of baptizing an infant. Baptizing infants is going to be a big thing. Even when we start to get to America, start to get the Reformation movement, it's going to be a big. Alexander Campbell is going to have multiple debates over infant baptism. So infant baptism is really a big thing. And this idea of rebaptizing people and baptizing by immersion challenged that faith. And even though these guys are reformers, even though they're wanting to change the religious landscape and change the way that religion's done and change the way we look at the Bible and get back to the Bible, change is hard, right? And when you start to change things that people have done their entire life, then it is challenging. And infant baptism was a really challenging thing on a lot of levels because, for one thing, there wasn't any other baptism. There was not any other baptism. So if you said infant baptism's not right, that challenged everything out there at that time, everybody. Wasn't just saying, oh, well, it's everybody. So all of a sudden they're saying, oh, so nobody's saved. You see? You know, when Alexander Campbell got to which we'll talk about this later, but when he got to that point where he finally decided infant baptism wasn't correct, wasn't what you needed to do, one thing that really bothered him was because basically when he kind of made that statement or made that jump, then basically he almost said the church didn't exist for centuries. Have you ever really thought about that? Right? Because there wasn't any other method, any other form, any other format. It was infant baptism. That was it. You sprinkled babies, poured water over their head as babies, and that's all that you ever did. So there wasn't anything else. So this became a big thing. And here it really, every time I look at this and read this, it just almost astounds me, I guess. I just can't believe you would kill somebody for baptizing somebody. But that's where we're at this point in history. But Luther, he's our German, right? And he is, and we talked about him a little bit last Sunday morning. And he had a lot of problems with the sale of indulgences. He had a lot of problems with the sale of relics. He had a lot of problems with a lot of things that the Catholic Church did, and that's why he made this 95 Theses that he printed and was circulated and do the printing press. It moved, right? Within 2 weeks, it spread throughout Germany, and within 2 months throughout Europe. Luther's writings circulated widely, reaching France and England and Italy as early as 1519. Luther's where the Lutheran Church comes from, but Lutheranism still becomes largely Calvinistic, right? He was captured, or he was taken in kind of a ruse capture. He was locked in a castle. He was at this point is where he basically, in Wartburg Castle, this is where he basically translated the New Testament from Greek into German and poured out doctrinal and polemical writings. He So this is where the Bible was going to get translated into German, into the German language. Luther was very instrumental in that. And the Lutheran Church is going to flow out of that, out of Luther, out of Germany. And so that becomes a big thing. But also there was translational bias in this. He believed in faith only, and we're going to talk about that. And that was really the Protestant movement, was faith only faith, only belief, nothing else, because they were trying to break as far away from Catholicism, as far away from the Church of England, as far away from that as they could. And so that's where we get this idea of faith only, but that's going to translate into this Calvinistic doctrine, which is kind of where we were last Sunday and where we're getting. He completely broke with the Catholic Church, right? He devised his own catechism, and that was kind of the basis, would be the basis of Lutheranism, and still the basis of Lutheranism today. But this guy is the guy we really need to talk about. He was kind of he was really kind of a bad guy. I mean, I should say that in a good light, but he was pretty rough. I mean, he was pretty hard to get along with. But he was a theologian. He influenced what we do in the United States probably more than any other person, any other reformer that ever lived. We in this country, churches in this country, are very Calvinistic, and I'll try to explain that. And you are very influenced by Calvin, whether you know you are or not. We all kind of have that in this country. He was a Frenchman. He was a French theologian and a pastor during the Protestant Reformation. He was the principal figure in the development of the system of Christian theology that we call Calvinism. I was raised Baptist. Baptist is a very Calvinistic religion. Most religions in this country are. He probably is more influential in Western religion than maybe any other person. He took this idea, and we have this an acronym, TULIP. He took this idea of faith only to this level that's going to basically influence religion from this point forward. And whether or not you know it, and I'm going to try to expand upon this a little bit, a lot of churches today in this country, really, this is the basic point of doctrine. And it comes back to this idea of faith only, but it comes back to more than that. It comes back to the idea of predestination, okay? Predestination is a really hard road to go down. I don't believe in it to an extent. I do believe there's things in the Bible that were predestined to happen. I do believe that. I believe Jesus Christ was predestined to come to this earth and die on a cross. I don't think you can get away from that. I do believe that John the Baptist was kind of predestined to do what John the Baptist did. I just don't think John had a lot of choice in the matter. I think that his course was kind of set, you know. But I do believe that we have free will. I do believe that God is omniscient. I believe that he has the ability to know what we'll do. I don't believe maybe he always wants to know that. I think we all have free will. But in the Bible, there's certain places, especially in Paul's writing, that if you want to take it that way, could lead to the idea of predestination. Those he knew, he also called. Romans 8:28, right? That whole chapter in there, right, kind of sometimes leads to the idea that we're called, that certain people are called and certain people aren't called. And Jesus kind of alluded to that in certain places in the Bible. I believe there's a predestined plan. I believe those of us who are obedient to the gospel of Christ, there's a predestined plan. I believe that we'll get to heaven. I believe there's a plan in place. But I don't believe that we're predestined to follow that plan. But Calvin did. And because of that, it's influenced us to this day. When I was a child growing up, I was raised in the Baptist church, and the Baptist church believes in predestination. They believe in, and I'll get into that a little bit. So what does that mean? Well, Calvin believed that all men were deprived. We all kind of agree with that. Total depravity. means that all of us are basically lost, that there's no hope without Christ, that there's no way that you and I can pull ourselves out of the muck and mire, that basically without grace, without Jesus, we're all lost. And we agree with that, right? But he also believed in unconditional election. And basically what that means is that we don't really have a choice. We're predestined to heaven or we're predestined to hell. And that you and I really don't have a say on that. When I was growing up and people would leave the church, they never said that they had fallen from grace. They always said, well, they were just never saved in the first place, right? In other words, you see what I'm saying? This idea that you and I don't have a choice. Basically, our course is set. The psalmist says in the 139th Psalm, he says that all our days were ordained before one of them came to be, right? In other words, it's all set. But I can argue the other side of that a lot more effectively, and I don't think that is what David meant when he said that. But there are places in the Bible that allude to that idea, right? Allude to that idea. So, in that case, it means Jesus Christ did not die for everybody. It means it was a limited atonement. So, in other words, Jesus Christ, if you believe in predestination, you believe in unconditional election, that you're predestined to heaven or predestined to hell, then Jesus Christ, therefore, did not die for all of mankind. He died for those who was predestined to be saved. We call that limited atonement, okay? In other words, he only died for those who were actually going to be saved. He didn't die for, well, in a way, that's kind of true in a way, right? Because if we don't accept Jesus, we're not obedient to the gospel. But we all know that Jesus died for all mankind. But because of that, this was Calvin's conundrum, okay? How do you know you're saved, right? In other words, if I'm predestined to go to heaven, or you're predestined to go to heaven, then how do we know that, right? How do you know? Because it's not your decision. So how do you know that you are? How do you know your name's on the list or not on the list? Or how do you know that? So Calvin believed, and early reformers believed, and a lot of people still today believe, that that's called irresistible grace. In other words, if you're predestined to be saved, predestined to go to heaven, that God's grace is irresistible to you. That you're going to know. Now, that brings up a whole nother idea. And it brings up this idea of, well, how do I know, right? Well, over time, that morphed a little bit. Calvin believed that you would know it because it just was irresistible to you. And you would have, and as that doctrine started to manifest itself, it come to this idea that it not only wouldn't be irresistible to you, but that at some point in your life, you would basically have this revelation moment. You would have this time, this point, something would happen in your life that would let you know that you were saved, that you would have this moment, this time, this idea. So basically, it kind of come down to this idea that you would have this kind of salvational experience. In other words, you would be somewhere or out plowing the field or whatever, and all of a sudden you would have this epiphany, that this moment where you would just feel that God had come on you and that you had this moment and that the heavens were basically open and you kind of had this revelation that, you were saved. Well, that kind of morphed a little further over time. And in the Pentecostal movement, which doesn't exist at this time, okay? We're not to Pentecostalism yet. That doesn't exist yet. But in the Pentecostal movement, it come to this idea that you would have this, like you could have this Holy Spirit experience, speak in tongues. So basically, what happened was, over time, is that in order for you to be part of a congregation or part of a church, you would recount your salvational experience. And then people would assess that to see if they thought that was realistic or not. And if it was, then they would vote you in. Okay? When I was growing up in the Baptist church, I never really knew where that came from. We would vote on people. Never really knew where that came from. That was just how it always was. And when somebody would come forward and want to place membership, they would vote them in. Everybody that thinks it ought to be, yes, everybody. I never known anybody ever get voted out, but I'm just saying that's how it was done. And when somebody would come from another congregation and they would come to church and they would want to place membership, they would bring them down and they'd say, this person has a letter from this church or whatever, and everybody thinks this person ought to be a member, say yes or whatever, and they would vote them in. Well, I never understood that until I started studying church history. But what happened is that that's what would happen. These people would have this salvational experience, and they would come before this group or this church or congregation, whatever word you want to use, and they would basically recount that experience. I was out milking the cow one morning, and all of a sudden the sunlight come through the window, and I just felt God there, and I just knew that, and they would recount this experience, and then people would vote on whether they thought that was realistic or not. But that was what happened in this idea of irresistible grace, okay? Is that somehow, if it's not up to me, whether I'm saved or not, somehow God has to make it known to me that I'm in a saved state, okay? And that would be irresistible to me. And then, because I'm predestined to be saved, because I'm predestined to heaven, I can't fall, right? I mean, if God's predestined me to go to heaven, then there's no way I can miss, right? And we call that perseverance of the saints. In other words, if you're predestined to heaven, you can't go to hell. That's the crux of predestination, right? If you're predestined to go to heaven, you can't go to hell. So this tulip, this idea of faith only, and this idea of predestination is going to kind of become the basis of most religion in the United States, and still is the basis for most religion in the United States today. Whether or not people know that, whether or not people are aware of that, I grew up in that. I grew up in that doctrine. I grew up, and I never understood it. I never knew that we believed that. I never really knew that because nobody ever told me, and I wasn't smart enough, I guess, or inquisitive enough to go figure it out for myself. So I never really knew that's what I grew up believing, but it was, whether or not I knew it, right? That's kind of what I grew up with. So that was a big influence, and we call that Calvinism, and it was a big influence and still a big influence to this day. So when I was a kid growing up, I'll share one more thing with you. When I was a kid growing up and you was trying to convert somebody, we always my life growing up, I always heard accept your salvation. I never heard to be saved. I just heard to accept your salvation. In other words, the idea that you're already saved, you just need to accept it. So if you believe that, then baptism, as you and I know it, it doesn't really have any salvational significance. Does that make any sense? Because you're already saved, right? So baptism just simply becomes, well, what my whole childhood, I always heard it was an outward act of an inward healing. So that's what I always heard growing up. But it became a way just to baptize you into that church or that denomination or that particular faith. It wasn't because it had anything to do with salvation. It had nothing to do with salvation. So when people are baptized into a Calvinistic church, is that baptism legitimate? And I still go back to the idea it depends on why they think they were baptized as an individual. What were they doing? Not what, because I never understood this. I was raised in that church. I was raised in a Baptist church. I never understood this. Nobody ever taught me this. I did not understand what I believed or what they believed. I did not understand it. Nobody ever told me. So I never knew this until I studied it for myself. I never understood it. So, I think that's something that you see in churches and people don't ever really question the faith they grow up in. It's just not something most people ever do. So this could be a revelation to certain people, I think. But John Knox, the Presbyterians, all this stuff came out of this Calvinistic flow, Calvinistic movement. It became a predominant basis of doctrine in the Reformation. So we got to get a few centuries past here to get to where you and I are. But this is the start of it. This is kind of the start of that, moving us out of that. It became a theory of visible manifestation of saving grace. And a lot of Pentecostalism, I'm not saying that right anyway, the Pentecostal movement largely is going to come out of this manifestation of grace, okay? In other words, if you're saved, God's going to make it known. And how's he going to make it known? Right? By the Holy Spirit, doing something to show you that you're saved, right? So that all starts to flow out of this doctrine, okay? You need to know where this stuff all comes from. Oops, that's an old slide. 2017, last time I taught this. So the Great Awakening. So let's get to the United States, okay? So we call these the Great Awakenings, and this part of the United States religious movement, and it's these pivotal points in history where things really changed, and we call them the Great Awakenings. Some people think there's 4. I don't know. I think that's an overdeal, but some people think there's 4 Great Awakenings. In 1720 through 1750, leaders of the awakening, such as Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, had little interest in merely engaging parishioners' minds. They wanted to elicit an emotional response, okay? This is where we started to get into this idea that I just don't want to teach you, I want you to feel it, okay? And so these guys, they didn't just want to teach. They wanted it to be emotional. They wanted an emotional response. Because if you're predestined to be saved and grace is irresistible to you, then somehow that ought to do something, right? It ought to make something happen. And so they wanted an emotional response, one which might yield the workings and evidence of saving grace. You see how all this kind of flows out of this idea? They also wanted to see people who were noticeably moved in the audience and stood out amongst the rest. So they wanted it to become very emotional. And this is the start of what we call the mourner's bench. We'll talk about that a little bit, okay? Where people would come down to the altar and pray at the altar. They wanted people to be emotionally moved. They wanted to see that salvation. They thought, okay, if you're predestined to be saved and grace is irresistible, then we ought to be able to see it. We ought to be able to see an emotion, see a response. And so they started preaching. It started working, not just to engage people's minds, but they wanted it to become emotional. They wanted to engage their emotions. And so preaching started to change, and what they wanted out of a congregation wanted to change. And this is centuries, okay, we're moving through the centuries. Joseph Tracy, the minister, historian, and preacher who gave this religious phenomenon his name, in his influential 1842 book, The Great Awakening, saw the first Great Awakening as a precursor to the American Revolution. So he really saw a lot of things happening. He saw it as a precursor to the Revolution. He saw people changing, emotions becoming involved. The second Great Awakening was strongest in the western states, following the revival at Cane Ridge. We're going to talk about Cane Ridge in Kentucky. Also, the burned-over district in upstate New York. New denominations, including several major religions, the religious denomination groups and societies, including Seventh-day Adventists, the Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, and the Latter-day Saint movement, all came out of the Second Great Awakening. So that really started at Cane Ridge, 1801. So that really started about in the early 1800s. And that's what we call the Second Great Awakening. And a lot of these other religious movements are going to break out of this Second Great. And they started these, well, we'll talk about it. We're getting there. The Third Great Awakening in the 1880-1910 was characterized by new denominations, very active missionary work, and also the social gospel approach to social issues. So that is about 1880-1910. And then some people say the Fourth Great Awakening was in the 1960s in the early 70s, where the mainline Protestant denominations weakened sharply in both membership and influence, while the most conservative religious denominations, such as Southern Baptists and the Missouri Synod Lutheran, grew rapidly in numbers, spread across the United States, and grave internal theological battles and schisms became politically powerful. So a lot of people think there was a fourth Great Awakening in the 60s and 70s, which is where a lot of the mainline, and what it means mainline, we're talking about Episcopal, Catholicism, Greek Orthodox, old school religions, where a lot of people started really breaking off from that and going into what we would call more mainstream religions, which was the Baptists, kind of away from the Lutherans, Presbyterians. You know, you kind of got those groups, right, that come out of there, and I don't know that I can go back that far, but I probably can. Let me go back. I should have put that up here too, and I didn't do it. Somewhere back, there we are. Forward. Okay. So that kind of gives you the idea of how a lot of that, how we split off. And I should go further forward than that, but when you get into this 1500 area, 16th century stuff, right in here, this is where your Anabaptist comes off, where we talked about with Zwingli and all them. This is really where you get Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, all those guys are in here, and that was the big break coming out of that. But then once we move, you know, on past that into the United States era, then that's where we get into these Great Awakenings. These other religions are going to start breaking off of that. But, you know, we're all up here, right? We're all up here. This is the United States side of life. The other side down here, this really doesn't hit us. This is us up here. This is where we're going to come from. The Anglican Church, Protestant, Anabaptist, all that other stuff, that's really what influences you and I in the United States today. So that kind of gets us up to these guys. Once I get there again. Okay, so now we're moving forward. United States, what happens here? Well, a lot of religions, you all know from your high school history that the Protestants really came to the United States because they wanted to get away from the Catholicism, Church of England. They were persecuted under that. So the Protestant movement, which is faith-only movement, they really wanted to come here, so they came to the United States. But on top of that, you've got all these other reformers, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, Anglican, all these other religions are coming to the United States because guess what? They all want this religious freedom, okay? They all want to get out from underneath this rule of Catholicism, all these things that they're under. So they all start to move towards the United States, and they want to bring their religion to the United States and bring their influence to the United States and spread their doctrine in the United States. And so as time goes on, especially the Methodists, the Baptists, but really, you know, I think when I think of this period of time, I'm more thinking Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran. That's probably predominant. And all these different denominations, they had these circuit riders, they called them. These guys who went out and would go to would ride these big circuits on horseback, and they would be the preacher for whatever, and they would spread this message, spread this gospel. So Thomas Campbell, he's a Presbyterian minister, and Alexander Campbell, these two guys we're going to talk about because they're really influential in why you're here, why you're where you're at. These two guys were very, very influential in this. They're really how come them and Barton Stone are the guys that really started what we would call the Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ. These guys all basically come out of Presbyterianism. They wanted to reform Presbyterianism. We're going to talk about that, but it really didn't work out for them. And these guys all came together in the Second Great Awakening. Cane Ridge Revival, 1801, was in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. That's where Barton W. Stone was, Cane Ridge. You know why it's called Cane Ridge? It's called Cane Ridge because Davy Crockett hid there, and it was full of cane, and he called it Cane Ridge, believe it or not. And I actually got to go here. Actually went there. Actually went to Actually went to his church in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. Actually took a trip out there to go see where all this started. It's a little nondescript building out in the middle of the woods. But they had this huge camp meeting there, and we'll talk about that. And there were thousands of people that showed up. They started to have these huge camp meetings, and thousands of people would show up. And they would preach from these stumps and everything else all around this, all at the same time. And that was where the Second Great Awakening, where all this came from. But we got to move back a little bit, because these guys are Presbyterians. So what does that mean? Well, the Presbyterian became the state church of Scotland. So once again, it became this interactive thing. And that was because of the Bishops' War. But the Presbyterian church is going to split, okay? And it's going to split into these different divisions: the seceder, the Burgess seceder, and the anti-Burgess seceder. And so this division that happened in Scotland, it traveled towards Ireland. So the reason I bring that up is because there's things changing inside of these mainstream denominations too. There's splits going on and changes being made, and people are challenging what they believe and challenging what's being taught. And so Campbell became an Anna-Burger seceder Presbyterian. And then the next split became Old Light and New Light Presbyterians. So the reason I bring that up is because he was involved in this changing within this Presbyterian church. They saw, even within these denominations that were coming out of this Reformation, there's changes being made. People are splitting off of it. People are not agreeing. People are having their own ideas. People are developing their own theologies. And so he's part of that. He is learning, he's changing, he's growing in what he believes. And so Campbell became this Presbyterian, but he's kind of this offshoot of this mainline Presbyterian. They believed they were the one true church, and all persons of any denominational stripe ought to be disfellowshipped. This included other divisions of Presbyterians. And the reason I want to kind of talk about that a little bit is because by the time this came to the United States, people were still very divided religiously. Now, I told you we had these circuit riders that went out, and you would have a Presbyterian circuit rider, a Methodist, or a Lutheran, and these different, they might only go around these different churches once every several months because they had this large area. Asbury was a great Methodist circuit rider. You know the Asbury Methodist Church in Tulsa? That's named off Asbury. Asbury was a Methodist circuit rider. He was a very prominent circuit rider of the Methodist Church. That's where that's named from. These guys were dedicated. They rode these horses through the countryside to these different places. And if you were a Presbyterian, per se, or maybe you were a Lutheran or whatever you were, and you wanted to get married, even though these other circuit riders would come through, you wouldn't allow them to marry you. You had to wait for your guy. And so if you wanted to get married, since it would be months, you would just go out in the town square and you would declare that you were married. And then once your guy came around, whoever he was, or if you had babies, because they were still baptizing infants, right? All these Presbyterians and all these are baby baptizers are all Petio Baptists. So if you had babies, you would wait until your guy, if you were Lutheran or Presbyterian, you'd wait until your guy come around. And when he rode into town, he would take care of all that. He would marry all the Presbyterians or whatever. He would baptize all the little Presbyterian babies. They wouldn't let anybody else do that. So it wasn't like they were getting along, okay? They were all very divided at this point in religious history. They were all very divided. And so these Presbyterians that were coming over, like Campbell and like Thomas Campbell and Alexander Campbell, that's what these guys came to do. The Presbyterians brought them over, and they made them these circuit riders that were going to go all around, go preach the Presbyterian way to all these rural communities and all these places on the American frontier. they were going to ride out, and these guys are predominantly going to be, Campbell is predominantly going to be in Pennsylvania. Okay, y'all, I don't think of Pennsylvania as the American frontier, but it was at that time. Very separated, very isolated, and he was sent, and him and Thomas and Alexander Campbell are going to be sent into Pennsylvania, and that's mostly where they're going to be, is in Pennsylvania. Barton Stone is in Kentucky, part of that movement in Kentucky. So I'm kind of setting the stage. Next week we'll start talking about how all this comes together. But, you know, I hope you begin to see that there's a lot of religious history behind you sitting in this pew, right? There's a lot of history behind you sitting where you're sitting. And we really need to know where we come from, I think, in order to know where we're at. And that's kind of the purpose of why we're doing this, is to kind of learn where we come from. I skipped a lot of stuff in here, and if you're a religious history buff, I mean, this is all out there. There's books. I've got books you can borrow. There's a lot of stuff on the internet. You can fill in a lot of the gaps. If you want to go down those rabbit holes and chase them rabbits, get on the internet and look at these guys. They were all smart men. They were all men who cared about God, who cared about faith. It's interesting, you know, I think, who we are, where we came from. So thanks for your time this morning.